Welcome to Storytime with Killian Flinn. Today's story is The Black Fog. Leave a like, share, and subscribe. Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Fog. The town of Dover's Hollow had always been a quiet place. A town where everyone knew each other, where front doors remained unlocked at night, and where the biggest scandal was old Mrs. Watkins' cat getting stuck on the church roof again. But all that changed on Monday, October 7th. That was the day the black fog came. At first, no one thought much of it. It was morning, and mist often rolled in from the eastern marshlands. The people of Dover's Hollow were used to fog. The early risers, farmers, store owners, and school bus drivers simply squinted through the thick air and carried on with their morning. But by noon, something felt wrong. The sun never burned through it like usual. In fact, it seemed to have vanished entirely. A thick black wall of mist had swallowed the farmlands, stretching across the horizon like an ocean of ink, growing denser by the hour. At first, people just talked about it in passing. "Strangest fog I've ever seen," said John Peters, the town's gas station owner, as he wiped down the pumps. "Ain't normal. Not this thick, not this dark. It'll burn off," the bank teller Marcy O'Connell replied. "Weather does weird things this time of year." But by 1:30 p.m., Dover's Hollow realized this wasn't normal fog. By 2:00 p.m., the town couldn't see the main road anymore. By 2:30 p.m., someone walked into it, and they never came back. The first disappearance. His name was Martin Walker, owner of Walker's Auto Repair. At 2:30 p.m., he had parked his truck near Debbie's Diner like he always did on Mondays. He stepped inside, ordered his usual black coffee and a ham sandwich, and sat by the window, watching the fog crawl over the street. "What the hell?" he muttered. At that point, the entire street outside had disappeared. The only thing visible beyond the window was pure blackness, a thick, swirling mist that ate the light and made the street lamps flicker, even though the sun was still technically up. Martin took one last sip of his coffee and stood up. "Guess I better go before it gets worse." Debbie, the diner owner, watched as he stepped out the door. She saw him take 3 steps forward. And then he was gone. No scream, no sound. Just gone. Debbie blinked. Her stomach tightened. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Her hands began to shake. "Martin!" she called through the door. No answer. Then she heard it. A sound coming from inside the fog. A soft, distant whisper. Indistinct. Hollow. Her skin crawled. She stepped back inside the diner, locked the door, and grabbed the phone. It was 2:38 p.m. when she called the sheriff's office. "Sheriff?" she said, voice shaking. Something just happened to Martin Walker. The town notices by 3 p.m. word had spread. Sheriff David Holloway and his deputy Tom Willis arrived at the diner. Debbie stood at the entrance, arms crossed, face pale. "What do you mean he just disappeared?" Holloway asked. "I mean, he walked into the fog and never came back," Debbie snapped. Willis frowned. "You sure he didn't just walk out of sight?" Debbie glared. "I was standing right here," she said. "He didn't walk away. He didn't turn. He took 3 steps forward, and then he was gone." Sheriff Holloway sighed. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about the air felt wrong. He turned to Willis. "Call the fire department. We're going in." Willis nodded and grabbed the radio. Holloway stepped to the edge of the fog. It was dense, shifting unnaturally like living shadows curling in slow motion. Something deep inside it made his stomach tighten. Then, from the blackness, he heard a sound. A whisper. Faint, indistinct. Holloway's blood ran cold. Another one vanishes. At 3:15 p.m., Jessica Palmer ran into the sheriff's office. "My son," she gasped. He ran into the fog. I can't find him." Sheriff Holloway's heart dropped. "How long ago?" 10 minutes. I went after him, but I couldn't see anything. I heard him calling me, but then he just stopped." Willis grabbed his rifle. "Sheriff, we gotta..." Holloway was already moving. By 3:20 p.m., they were at Jessica's house, which was on the outskirts of town, dangerously close to where the fog had first appeared. Jessica's front yard was gone. In its place was a thick, swirling mass of black vapor, moving slowly, as if breathing. "Benny!" Jessica screamed, standing at the edge. The fog did not respond. Holloway grabbed his radio. "We need backup now." Then he turned to Tom Willis. "We're going in." Willis swallowed hard. "Sir, are you sure? If there's even a chance that boy is still alive, we have to try." Jessica sobbed. Please find him." Holloway took a deep breath, and then they stepped into the fog. Inside the fog, everything changed the second they stepped inside. The air was freezing, thick like wet cement. Their flashlights barely pierced the inky blackness around them. Willis tightened his grip on his rifle. "Sheriff," he whispered. "I'm here," Holloway said. Then, a sound. A faint, distant cry for help. "Benny?" Holloway called. The sound echoed back. Then, a whisper. But this time it was closer. Willis stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Holloway turned. "Hear what?" Then he saw it. A figure standing just a few feet ahead. At first it looked like a man. Tall, motionless. But then it tilted its head unnaturally, and Holloway realized it had no face. Sheriff David Holloway had seen some terrifying things in his time. He'd pulled bodies from the creek after accidents. He'd broken up violent fights between angry drunks. He'd even been shot at once during a failed gas station robbery. But this was something else. Standing in the black fog just a few feet ahead of him was a figure. It wasn't moving. It had no face. Just smooth, stretched skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. And yet, Holloway felt it looking at him. He took a step back. "Willis," he whispered. His deputy stood frozen beside him, rifle shaking in his hands. "Sheriff," Willis stammered. "What the hell is that?" The thing tilted its head as if considering the question. Then it took a step forward. A sudden attack. The moment the thing moved, Holloway acted on instinct. He grabbed Willis by the arm, yanking him backward. "Run!" he barked, but the fog was too thick. They turned, disoriented, the black mist pressing against them, wrapping around their bodies like something alive. Behind them, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Willis gasped for breath. "Well, we have to get out." "I know," Holloway snapped. He gripped Willis's jacket, pulling him along. They moved blindly, trying to find their way back. But then a whisper slid through the air. A voice, but not human. It was low and stretched, like the sound of wind passing through a hollow pipe. And it said his name. "David?" Holloway froze mid-step. His blood ran ice cold. The thing in the fog knew his name. The boy in the mist. Before he could process it, he heard another voice. This one was familiar, weak, small. "Help! Help me!" Holloway turned. Somewhere in the fog, Benny Palmer was still alive. "Benny!" Holloway shouted. "Where are you?" The child sobbed. I don't know. It's dark." The sheriff's heart pounded. "Keep talking, kid. We're coming." He grabbed Willis's shoulder, pulling him toward the voice. But with every step, the fog grew colder. And then Benny screamed. A sound so raw, so full of terror, it sent chills crawling down Holloway's spine. "Go, go!" he shouted. They ran forward, blindly pushing through the black mist. And then suddenly, the fog parted. Holloway skidded to a stop, his breath caught in his throat, because Benny Palmer was right in front of him, and something was holding him. The Hollow Men. The thing stood at least 7 feet tall, its long, thin arms wrapped around Benny's tiny body. Its face was featureless, like stretched wax over bone. It turned its smooth head toward Holloway. Benny squirmed in its grasp. "Hey, please," the boy sobbed. Holloway raised his gun. "Let him go." The thing didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It just stood there, waiting. Willis, still shaking, lifted his rifle. "Sheriff, what do we do?" Holloway's mind raced. He had no idea if bullets would work on this thing. But there was only one way to find out. His finger tightened on the trigger. But then the thing spoke. Or rather, it whispered. A voice not from a mouth, but from the fog itself. "You do not belong here." Then it moved. The fight for Benny. The creature's long fingers tightened around Benny's arm. The boy let out a cry of pain. Holloway fired. The gunshot exploded in the fog, the sound swallowed instantly by the mist. The bullet hit, but instead of blood, the thing rippled like water, absorbing the impact. It didn't flinch. It didn't stagger. It simply turned its head toward Holloway and let go of Benny. The boy fell to the ground, gasping. Willis rushed forward, grabbing Benny and pulling him back. "Run!" Holloway bellowed. And then the thing lunged. Escape from the fog. It moved too fast. A blur of blackened limbs stretching toward Holloway like shadowy vines. He barely had time to duck as its hand swept over his head, missing him by inches. Willis and Benny were already running. Holloway turned and sprinted after them. Behind him! The footsteps followed. But the fog was shifting now, pulling away like something was forcing it back. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, twisting into one word. Leave! Holloway burst from the black mist, tumbling onto the street. Willis and Benny were already there, panting. Then, the fog stopped moving. It hovered, just at the town's edge, curling and shifting. But it did not cross over. Holloway stared into it. Something inside the fog was still watching them. Then, slowly, it faded back into the darkness. And for the first time in hours, the town of Dover's Hollow was silent again. Sheriff David Holloway stood at the edge of the black fog, his chest rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. His hands trembled. His heart thundered in his chest, but he was alive. And so was Benny Palmer. Deputy Tom Willis had collapsed onto the pavement beside them, his rifle still clenched in his hands, his eyes wide with terror. No one spoke. Not at first. The fog loomed just ahead, swirling in slow, deliberate movements. It was waiting. Watching! Holloway could feel something inside it. A presence. An intelligence. A hunger. Then, Benny sobbed. That broke the silence. Holloway turned and knelt beside the boy, gripping his shoulders. "Hey, kid. Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. You're safe." Benny shook his head violently. "No, I'm not." Holloway swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Benny's tear-streaked face lifted toward the fog, and in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, "They're still inside me." Something came back with him. Sheriff Holloway's stomach twisted. His grip tightened on Benny's shoulders. "Benny," he said carefully, his voice low. "What do you mean?" The boy shuddered, his fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Willis took a step back. "Sheriff, this kid, something's wrong with him." Benny's breathing hitched. And then his eyes rolled back in his head. A sound escaped his lips. Low, garbled, like whispers layered over each other. And in that sound, Holloway heard his own name. Not just once, 1,000 times, like a chorus of unseen voices calling to him from the fog. "David! David! David!" The sheriff's blood ran cold. Willis stumbled backward. "What the hell?" Benny's mouth opened wider, unnaturally wide. And then he collapsed. The whispering stopped. Holloway caught him before he hit the ground. Benny's body was burning hot, his skin slick with sweat. His eyes fluttered open, normal again. The voices were gone. But Holloway knew something had come back with him. And whatever it wasn't finished. The town reacts. By the time they got Benny to Dover's Hollow Medical Center, it was already past midnight. The streets were deserted. The entire town was on lockdown. News of the fog had spread. And the fact that 5 people were missing had everyone terrified. Benny's mother, Jessica Palmer, burst through the hospital doors sobbing the moment she saw her son. She pulled him into a tight embrace, her body trembling. "Oh my God!" she gasped. "Oh, Benny, baby, you're okay." Benny didn't say anything. He stared blankly over her shoulder. Sheriff Holloway exchanged a look with Dr. Lorraine Huxley, the town's physician. "Take him in," Holloway said quietly. "Run whatever tests you have to—" "Doctor!" Huxley frowned. "Is he hurt?" Holloway hesitated. How the hell was he supposed to explain that the kid had just whispered in 1,000 voices that weren't his own? He cleared his throat. "Just keep an eye on him." Huxley nodded and led Benny inside. Jessica followed, holding her son's hand. As they disappeared down the hall, Holloway turned to Willis. We need to talk to the mayor. The meeting at City Hall. By 1 a.m., every major figure in town had been called to an emergency meeting. They gathered inside Dover's Hollow City Hall, sitting in a dimly lit chamber, their faces filled with fear and confusion. At the head of the room sat Mayor Richard Wallace. His face was pale and tight, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "All right," Wallace said. "Somebody tell me what the hell is going on?" Holloway exhaled. "The fog isn't natural," he said. "It's alive." There was a beat of silence. Then a scoff. "Alive?" scoffed Samuel Grayson, the town's wealthiest businessman. "What kind of nonsense is that?" Holloway's jaw clenched. "You think I'm joking?" he snapped. Grayson shrugged. "I think you and your deputy are scaring the town over some bad weather." Willis slammed his hands on the table. 5 people are missing. That shut everyone up. Mayor Wallace swallowed hard. 5? Holloway nodded. Martin Walker, Jessica Palmer's son, before we got him back. 2 deputies. And a gas station worker. Missing? Wallace whispered. Or dead? Holloway met his eyes. "We don't know." Silence. The weight of it hung in the room like a thick cloud. Then, from the far corner, a frail voice spoke. "They won't stop." Holloway turned. It was Lily Holloway, the oldest woman in town, the last surviving Holloway family member, the only one who had been here when the town was first built. The moment Holloway saw her face, his stomach twisted, because she was crying. She never cried. Mayor Wallace frowned. "What do you mean they won't stop?" Lily looked at Holloway, and in a voice that sent chills down his spine, she said, "You let one of them in." The realization. The room fell silent. Sheriff Holloway's chest tightened. "Lily," he said, voice low, "what are you talking about?" She wiped her tears, shaking her head. "You brought something back with you," she whispered. Holloway felt cold all over. Willis shifted nervously. We got the kid out of there." Lily's eyes darkened. "Did you?" A shiver crawled down Holloway's spine, because for the first time, he wasn't sure. Sheriff David Holloway sat frozen in his seat. Lily Holloway's words hung thick in the air. "You let one of them in." The mayor cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Lily, what exactly do you mean by that?" Lily wiped her wet eyes, her frail fingers shaking. "They don't just take," she whispered. "They can wear us." Holloway's stomach twisted. "You're saying something came back with Benny?" Lily nodded slowly. Willis let out a harsh breath, rubbing his temples. No, that's... How the hell would that even work?" Lily's haunted eyes locked onto him. "It's not possession," she said softly. "It's something worse." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sheriff Holloway thought of Benny's blank stare in the hospital, the way his voice had changed in the fog, the way his whisper had sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And he knew. He knew Lily was right. Something had come back with the boy, and it was still inside him, a desperate plan. "We have to get back to the hospital," Holloway said, rising from his chair. Willis hesitated. "Sheriff, you really think—" "I don't think," Holloway snapped. "I know." They rushed out of City Hall, leaving the confused town leaders behind. As they stepped outside, Holloway noticed something off. The fog hadn't receded. It was thicker now, curling at the edges of the streets, creeping between buildings. It wasn't leaving. It was spreading. Willis saw it too. "Jesus Christ! We don't have much time," Holloway muttered. "Move!" They jumped into the squad car and tore through the empty streets, heading straight for Dover's Hollow Medical Center, because if they were right, if something was inside Benny, they had to stop it. Before it was too late. The hospital horror. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too quiet. The front doors stood slightly open, the hallway lights flickering. Holloway and Willis stepped out of the car, guns drawn. "Where is everyone?" Willis whispered. Holloway's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. A chill ran up his spine as they stepped into the reception area. Empty chairs, no nurses, no patients, just a single clipboard lying on the floor. And then a sound, a soft, wet whisper coming from down the hall. Holloway stiffened. It was coming from Benny's room. Willis swallowed hard. "Sheriff!" Holloway nodded. "Stay close." They moved down the dim corridor, their boots echoing too loud in the silence. The air was wrong here. Thick, damp, too cold for an insulated building. Then they reached the door. Room 204. The whispering was louder now, sliding against their skin like a crawling hand. Holloway grabbed the handle, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. Benny is gone. The room was empty. The bed was still there, the blankets tangled, the heart monitor flatlining in eerie silence. But Benny was gone. Holloway's pulse pounded in his ears. Where the hell? Then Willis let out a sharp breath. "Sheriff!" Holloway turned. Willis pointed at the far wall, and Holloway's stomach dropped. Because covering the entire surface, written in dripping black ink, was a message. A message written in Benny Palmer's handwriting. "Let me out!" Holloway staggered back, his blood running ice cold. Willis muttered a curse. "What the hell does that mean?" Then, the lights flickered off, plunging them into total darkness, and the whispering surrounded them. Chapter 2, The Hollow Passenger. The lights went out. Total darkness. Sheriff David Holloway and Deputy Tom Willis stood frozen in Benny Palmer's hospital room, staring at the terrifying message smeared across the wall in thick, dripping ink. "Let me out!" And then the whispering began. It wasn't human. It came from everywhere at once, slithering through the dark like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, speaking words that made no sense. Whispers inside whispers. Voices stretching and twisting, leaking from the walls, the floor, the air itself. Willis sucked in a sharp breath. "Sheriff?" Then the door slammed shut behind them. The shadows moved. The room shifted, the air pressing thick and heavy against their skin. The whispering grew louder. And then something moved in the dark. Holloway's pulse slammed against his ribs. He reached for his flashlight, his fingers slick with sweat. He flicked it on. A thin, yellow beam cut through the shadows and landed on the corner of the room. A figure was standing right there. At first, Holloway thought it was a child. Small, thin, then it shifted, and he saw it wasn't Benny. Not anymore. Benny is gone. It had his body, but the way it stood, too still, too rigid, too unnatural, was all wrong. Its skin was paler than before, almost ashen, like something half-formed, still unfinished. And then it turned its head. Not slowly like a person would, but in a single jerky motion, snapping toward them too fast. Holloway's stomach tightened. Willis stepped back, raising his gun. "Oh, what the hell is that?" The thing in the corner smiled, not in a normal way. Its lips pulled back too far, stretching into something grotesque and wrong. Then, in a voice layered with something inhuman, it whispered, "It's still inside me." Thus the attack Holloway fired first. The bullet hit the thing dead center, but instead of blood, something else came out. Black mist, thick, oozing. The moment the bullet hit, the room trembled. The whispering turned into a piercing shriek. Then the thing lunged. It moved too fast, crossing the room in a blink. Holloway barely had time to raise his arms before it slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. His flashlight rolled away, spinning wildly, sending flashes of light bouncing across the room. For a moment, he saw its face up close. Its eyes were gone, just smooth, stretched skin where they should have been. But he could feel it staring at him, and inside its hollow gaze he saw something worse, something behind the skin, something moving inside the body. Holloway choked back a scream. It wasn't just wearing Benny's body. It was trying to become him. Willis fights back. A gunshot exploded in the room. The thing lurched back, its body jerking unnaturally. Willis fired again, gripping his gun with shaking hands. "Sheriff, move!" he shouted. Holloway rolled away just as the thing twisted its head toward Willis. And then it spoke again. Only this time it wasn't whispering. It was screaming. A shriek so loud, so unnatural, it felt like it was splitting the air itself apart. The windows shattered instantly, glass raining down. The walls shook, the fluorescent light above them bursting into sparks. and then the door swung open. For the first time, Holloway realized the fog had crept inside the hospital, and they were not alone anymore. More are coming down the hall. Figures were stepping out of the mist. Tall, faceless, wrong. More of them. More hollow men. And they were walking straight toward them. Willis grabbed Holloway's arm. "We gotta go now!" Holloway didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight, grabbed his gun, and they ran. They rushed down the hall, the floor slick beneath them, the fog curling at their ankles. Behind them, the whispering returned, growing louder, closer. Holloway risked one last look over his shoulder. The thing that had once been Benny stood in the middle of the room watching them go. And as the sheriff turned away, he heard it whisper one last time, "You can't run forever." Sheriff David Holloway and Deputy Tom Willis ran for their lives. The hospital halls were no longer familiar. The dim fluorescence flickered, barely cutting through the thick black fog curling in from every direction. Behind them, the thing that had been Benny Palmer stood watching, its hollow face tilted slightly, as if curious. And beyond it, the hollow men were coming. "The chase begins." Willis gritted his teeth. "Sheriff, where the hell do we go?" Holloway's pulse slammed against his ribs. "Exits ahead! Keep running!" They barreled down the hallway, past darkened patient rooms where the lights had already gone dead. Then the whispering returned, low, breathless, like wind whistling through an empty skull, and it was all around them. Holloway didn't dare look back. He could feel the presence behind them. Multiple things, all watching, all following, moving in unnatural silence except for their whispers. A dead end, the hallway split into two directions. The red exit sign flickered at the end of the right hall. They ran for it. Willis reached the door first, slamming into it, gripping the handle, and his stomach dropped. Locked. "No, no, no!" He yanked, kicked, slammed his shoulder against the door. Nothing. The whispering grew closer. Holloway whirled around, gun raised, and his breath caught in his throat. The fog had thickened, curling unnaturally through the corridor. And standing just beyond it, they were waiting. Tall, thin hollow men, more than before. Motionless, watching. And then in eerie unison, they all took a step forward. Holloway's blood turned to ice. The fog moves. The black mist twisted unnaturally, creeping toward them like tendrils of living shadow. Willis fired his rifle. The shot echoed in the corridor, the bullet hitting something. But instead of dropping, the hollow man that had been hit simply shuddered. Its body rippled like it was made of liquid. Then it stepped forward again. Willis stared. Oh, hell no! The fog suddenly pushed inward, like a great inhale, and then it surged toward them, a black wave pouring into the hallway like a living thing. Move! Holloway roared. They turned just as the fog hit. Escape to the stairwell. Willis saw the stairwell door to their left. He grabbed Holloway's arm, yanking him toward it. Screw the exit! Stairs, go! They shoved through the door, nearly tripping down the steps as the fog slammed against the frame behind them. Holloway turned and froze. The fog didn't follow. It curled just beyond the threshold, waiting, like it was choosing not to enter. Willis bent over, gasping. What the hell? Why didn't it come after us? Holloway's jaw tightened. I don't know. And then from above them they heard a noise, a soft shuffle, then footsteps coming down the stairs. Willis raised his rifle. Shit, who's there? The answer came in a low whisper from the upper landing. You let me out. In a familiar voice, Holloway and Willis froze. The voice had come from above them, but it sounded wrong. A layered echo, like multiple people speaking at once. Then a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. A figure emerged, slowly descending step by step. It looked like Benny Palmer, but something about him was off. His arms were too long, his skin was too pale, and when he spoke again, his lips barely moved. You let me out. Willis raised his gun. Don't come any closer. Benny or whatever was wearing him stopped. Then he did something that made Holloway's stomach drop. He smiled. Slowly. Too wide. Too human and not human enough. And in the same layered voice, he whispered, You can't stop it. It's already here. The fog is everywhere. Holloway's mind raced. Benny had walked into the fog. He had disappeared. And now he wasn't the same. Whatever this was, it wasn't Benny anymore. The thing that had been Benny Palmer tilted its head, and behind it something shifted. The fog outside the stairwell moved again, pulsing like a living thing. Then the whispers multiplied. They were coming from all directions now, and Holloway finally understood. This wasn't just about Benny. It wasn't just the hospital. The fog had spread. It was everywhere now. Sheriff David Holloway and Deputy Tom Willis stood frozen in the stairwell, staring at the thing that used to be Benny Palmer. The boy stood just a few steps above them, his too wide smile stretching across his face, his body unnaturally still. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting jerky shadows across the walls. Willis raised his rifle. "Benny," he said cautiously, "if that's even still you need to back the hell up." The thing's head tilted unnaturally. Its voice, that awful layered whisper, slithered through the air. "I remember you." Holloway's throat tightened. Benny's mouth never moved when he spoke. The sound came from inside him. Something else was speaking through him. Something inside his skin. Then Benny's body twitched violently, his head snapping back, and the whispering grew louder. "They're everywhere now. The fog floods the town." A low, distant howl rumbled through the air. Not from Benny, not from the hospital. It was coming from outside, from the entire town. Holloway bolted up the stairs, shoving past Benny, his boots slamming against the steps as he threw open the roof access door. The cold night air hit him. But everything was wrong. The fog had completely overtaken Dover's Hollow. The streets were gone, swallowed in black mist. The buildings had vanished, replaced by swirling, living shadows. The streetlights flickered like dying embers. The town was drowning in the fog, and inside it, things were moving. Tall, thin, wrong. Hundreds of them. Thousands. All walking silently through the mist. Holloway's breath hitched. Chapter 3. Nowhere is safe. Sheriff David Holloway hit the ground hard. The air rushed from his lungs as he landed on the cold, damp floor. His ears rang, his head throbbed, and for a moment he couldn't tell if he was even still alive. Then movement. A shadow stirred nearby. Something was breathing in the dark. And then Benny spoke. "You should have left." Holloway's stomach tightened. The boy's voice was wrong. It came from the fog, not his throat. Holloway tried to push himself up, but his body felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing him down. The fog was inside the basement now, curling along the walls, slithering across the ceiling like living tendrils. And then he saw Benny. The boy stood a few feet away, but his form was shifting. His limbs twitched unnaturally. His skin moved, as if something beneath it was trying to crawl its way out. His eyes were gone. Just smooth, pale flesh where they should have been. And yet, Holloway knew he was being watched. A place forgotten. The basement was massive. Much bigger than Holloway expected. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the walls. They were covered in writing, carved deep into the concrete, as if someone had been scratching for years with bare, broken nails. The words were frantic, scrawled in overlapping patterns repeated over and over again. And in the dim emergency lighting, Holloway could just barely make them out. Don't listen to the voices. They are not your own. Do not let them in. Do not look at their faces. And the last message, carved larger than the rest. The fog is the door. Holloway's heart pounded against his ribs. His skin went cold. And then, Benny took a step toward him. The thing wearing Benny Holloway forced himself to stand, his body screaming in protest. He reached for his gun, but his holster was empty. Shit. He must have dropped it in the fall. His eyes flickered back to Benny, or what was left of him. The boy's jaw twitched. His neck tilted at a painful angle. And then, in that horrible, layered voice, he whispered, "It's too late." Then His body lurched forward, faster than any human should be able to move. Holloway barely had time to react before Benny's hand shot out and grabbed his arm. The second their skin touched, Holloway felt it. Something crawling into his mind. Whispers slithered through his skull, digging deep, filling his thoughts with voices that weren't his own. Memories twisted. His father's voice, his mother's laughter. The first time he put on his badge, all of it warped, replaced by things he didn't recognize. Dark places, faceless figures, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched from the other side of a door. Holloway clenched his jaw, gritted his teeth, and did the only thing he could think of. He ripped his arm free. Benny's grip broke, and Holloway stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped, but the cold feeling inside his mind remained. Something had touched him, and it had left a mark. The basement reveals its secret. A sudden bang echoed through the basement. Holloway spun around and saw Deputy Tom Willis standing in the stairwell, rifle raised, breathing hard. "Sheriff!" Willis shouted. "Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" Before Holloway could answer, Benny jerked toward the sound. He tilted his head, sniffing the air like a hungry animal. And then he moved. He lunged toward Willis so fast he blurred. Willis fired. The bullet ripped through Benny's chest. But just like before, there was no blood, just black mist spilling from the wound, curling like smoke. And then Benny laughed, a sound that didn't belong to a child. Then the basement shook. The walls groaned. And before Holloway could react, a section of the floor collapsed, revealing something beneath them. A tunnel, a massive spiraling hole in the earth. And from inside it, the whispering screamed, "The fog is a door." The basement had been built on something old, something buried, something that was never supposed to be found. Willis stood frozen, staring into the dark hole. What the hell is that? Holloway's mind was racing. The messages on the wall, the disappearances, the way the fog spread through town like it was alive. And the worst part, the Hollow Men weren't coming from the fog. The fog was coming from them. And it had been doing this for years, maybe even longer. Then Benny twitched violently, his body falling apart, black mist pouring from his mouth, his skin splitting like wet paper. And in his final breath, he whispered, "We are already here." Then he collapsed into a puddle of black liquid. His body was gone. Only the fog remained. And from inside the hole, something began crawling out. Sheriff David Holloway and Deputy Tom Willis stood at the edge of the collapsed floor, staring into the gaping hole that had just opened beneath them. The whispering had stopped. Now there was only silence. And in the darkness below, something was moving. The tunnel beneath the town. The pit was unnaturally deep. It stretched beyond the basement's foundations, sinking into blackness that swallowed light. It wasn't a sinkhole. It wasn't a cave. It was something else. Willis wiped sweat from his brow. "Jesus Christ! Sheriff, what the hell is this?" Holloway didn't answer, because he knew, somehow, deep in his gut, he knew exactly what they were looking at. The fog wasn't just covering Dover's Hollow. It was coming from here. And whatever had created it was still down there. Something is watching Holloway shined his flashlight into the pit. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing jagged walls of black stone, slick with moisture. Then movement. A shape shifted just beyond the light's reach. Something tall, something thin. Holloway's throat tightened. Willis saw it too. His rifle shook in his hands. "Sheriff, I think we just found where they come from." The Hollow Men hadn't come from the fog. The fog had come from them. And now, as Holloway stared into the pit, he saw the truth. This wasn't one of them. This was the first, and it had been waiting. It comes for them. A deep, shuddering breath rose from the tunnel. Not a sound. A feeling. Like the entire room was inhaling at once. The black fog in the basement twisted violently, spiraling toward the hole as if being sucked back into the earth. Then it climbed out. At first, Holloway thought it was one of the Hollow Men. But then he saw it was bigger. Its limbs were unnaturally long, stretching and bending as it pulled itself from the pit. Its body was half-formed, shifting between solid and mist, flickering like a bad signal. And its face? God, its face! It wasn't blank like the others. It had features. Stolen features. Mouths, eyes, noses, all overlapping, shifting across its face like a slideshow of people who no longer existed. Willis let out a sharp, broken breath. What the hell is that? Holloway took a step back. The thing tilted its head toward them. And then it spoke. Not in a whisper, not in human words, but in every missing voice in Dover's Hollow. Hundreds of voices, crying, begging, screaming. Holloway's knees almost buckled. Willis fired his rifle. The bullet hit, and the thing didn't even flinch. Then, in a voice that shook the walls, it spoke, "We never left. You're run or die." The room shook violently. The black fog surged forward, pouring from the pit, spilling across the floor like a living tide. Holloway grabbed Willis by the jacket and yanked him toward the stairwell. "Run!" They bolted up the stairs, the fog chasing them, clawing at their heels. Behind them, the thing crawled out of the pit completely, its massive form hunched in the basement, its stolen faces shifting and twitching. It took a step forward, and the entire hospital trembled. "Go, go, go!" Holloway bellowed. They burst through the stairwell doors, and the building shook again. The fog wasn't just inside anymore. It had spread outside, too, and the screams of the town filled the night. The town is gone. The streets were no longer visible, only shadows moving inside the black mist, figures standing motionless at every corner. The Hollow men had finished their work. Dover's Hollow wasn't a town anymore. It was theirs. Holloway's breath hitched. Willis staggered beside him, eyes wild with panic. "Sheriff, where the hell do we go?" Holloway didn't know. There was no escape. They had waited too long. And as the fog closed in, Holloway knew they had only one option left. Chapter 4, The Last Stand. Sheriff David Holloway stood in the middle of what used to be Main Street. But Dover's Hollow was gone. Everything was drowned in black fog, thick and suffocating, curling around buildings, swallowing up the street lamps. No more town, no more people, just whispers in the mist. And them, the Hollow men. They stood in the streets like statues, thin and tall, motionless, their faceless heads tilted slightly toward the sky. Hundreds of them, all watching, all waiting. And in the distance, something even bigger was coming. No more running Deputy Tom Willis stood beside Holloway, his rifle trembling in his grip. His face was pale, streaked with sweat. His breath came too fast, too shallow. "There's too many," Willis whispered. "Sheriff, we're—" Holloway already knew. They weren't getting out of this. The town had been swallowed whole. There was no more escape. But Holloway had never been the kind of man to go down without a fight. He reached into his belt, pulled his last 2 bullets from his pocket, and reloaded. "If we're going down," he said, cocking his gun, "we do it standing." Willis swallowed. Then he nodded. "Damn right." The Black Sea opens. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The Hollow men turned in unison, and from the thickest part of the fog, something massive began to rise. A towering figure, shifting and unstable, its body morphing between solid and mist. Its arms were too long, its face stolen from the voices inside the fog. It was the first Hollow one, the thing beneath the hospital, and it had finished waking up. Holloway stepped forward, gun raised. The whispers grew deafening, and in a voice that was not his own, the monster spoke. "There is no Holloway. There is no Willis. There is only us." The last fight, Willis fired first. The bullet ripped through the fog, but the creature did not react. Holloway fired next, aiming for its shifting head. But the bullet disappeared inside its body, like it had been swallowed by smoke. The thing tilted its head, and the shadows around it rippled. Then it reached for them. The black mist lunged forward, curling into tendrils that stretched toward Holloway and Willis. Holloway grabbed Willis and ran. The fog chased them, hissing, clawing at their backs, pulling at their clothes. They ducked behind an overturned police car, breathing hard. Willis panted. "Bullets don't work." "I know," Holloway muttered. He could hear the voices inside the fog, whispering inside his head, pressing against his skull like fingernails scratching the inside of his mind. He clenched his jaw. There had to be a way to stop it. There had to be a way to end this. The final choice. The Hollow Men began to move. Slow, deliberate, stepping toward them, their faceless heads tilting unnaturally. The first Hollow One loomed behind them, its body stretching too high, shifting too fluidly. Holloway's stomach twisted. Something inside him whispered the truth. The fog had been waiting for him for years. It had waited for someone to see it, someone to step inside, and now it would never let him go. Unless, Holloway took a slow breath. There was only one way to end this. He turned to Willis. "You need to run." Willis blinked. "What?" "You heard me," Holloway said, voice calm. "Go ahead, get the hell out of here." Willis shook his head. "Sheriff, I'm not leaving you." But Holloway had already made his decision. He grabbed Willis by the vest and shoved him toward the only path out. "Go!" Willis hesitated. Then, cursing, he turned and ran. The Hollow Men did not follow him. Their eyes were still on Holloway, because they knew he was the one who had to stay. Stepping into the fog, Holloway took a step forward. The first Hollow One towered above him, a mass of shadow and stolen voices. It did not attack. It did not move. It simply waited. Holloway exhaled. He stepped forward again. And then he stepped into the fog. The darkness wrapped around him instantly, swallowing him whole. The world went silent. And in that moment, he understood. The fog had never been alive. The fog had never been a curse. The fog had always been a door, and now it was closed. The morning after the next day, the fog was gone. The sun rose over Dover's Hollow, shining over the streets for the first time in days. There were no Hollow Men, no whispers. The town was empty. The only person left was Deputy Tom Willis. He stood in the center of the street looking around, but Sheriff Holloway was gone. No body, no trace, just silence. And then a cold wind whispered through the trees, and Willis heard it. A voice, soft and distant, carried on the wind. "We never left." Willis closed his eyes, because he knew Holloway wasn't gone. Not really. He was just somewhere else now, somewhere inside the fog. Sheriff David Holloway stepped forward into the swirling black mist, his breath steady but his hands clenched into fists. Behind him, Deputy Tom Willis was still running, his silhouette vanishing into the thin gap of light beyond the fog's reach. Holloway didn't follow, because he knew this was where his story ended. The first Hollow One stood towering before him, its massive, flickering form shifting between solid and shadow. Its face, or the mockery of one, was an ever-changing collage of stolen features, mouths opening and closing, eyes blinking in the wrong places, noses appearing only to fade a moment later. And it was watching him, not just with its borrowed eyes, but with something deeper, something older, something that had been waiting. Then, without moving its lips, it spoke. "You are the last." Holloway's blood ran cold. It didn't just mean the last person left in Dover's Hollow. It meant something worse. It meant the town is gone. You are all that remains. The fog decides. The black mist curled around his boots, coiling up his legs, moving like something alive. It didn't burn. It didn't hurt. But he felt it pressing against him, trying to find a way inside, trying to see if he belonged. And then a whisper slid through the air. Not from the first Hollow One. Not from the fog. From inside his own head. "You are already part of us." Holloway clenched his jaw. "I am not part of anything." The thing tilted its head. Then it raised one long, shifting hand and pointed to the fog at his feet. Holloway looked down, and his stomach dropped. Because the mist wasn't just around him anymore. It was seeping into his skin. Memories that aren't his. A sudden wave of dizziness hit him. The fog swirled up his arms, twisting into his veins, creeping into his chest. And then the memories came. Not his own. Someone else's. No, everyone else's. 100 lifetimes crashing into his mind at once. He saw the first settlers of Dover's Hollow, standing on the freshly cleared land, their faces lined with fear. They knew. They had built their homes on something they shouldn't have. And then he saw them, the first to disappear. A farmer walking into an early morning fog, his horse-drawn cart left behind. A child wandering too far from the settlement, never seen again. A preacher standing in the town square at dusk, only for his face to vanish, leaving behind nothing but smooth skin and empty prayers. The Hollow Men weren't new. They had been here since the beginning, and now they were showing him why. The fog's purpose, the voices in his head shifted. No longer memories. Now they were questions, as if the fog itself was deciding what to do with him. Do you belong? Will you stay? Holloway clenched his fists. He refused to become one of them. But the fog didn't stop. It pressed closer, peeling at his thoughts, his identity, his very self. It wanted to erase him, to make him part of the Hollow Ones. A man with no name, no face, no past, only whispers, only fog. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Sheriff David Holloway felt true fear. The last choice Holloway knew he had only one option left. If he let the fog take him, there would be nothing left of him. No more memories, no more Holloway, just another faceless thing standing in the mist. But if he fought, would he even stand a chance? The first Hollow One lifted its hand again. A single long, twisted finger pointed to his chest. And then, in a voice that echoed in the bones of the earth, it said, "Choose." Sheriff David Holloway stood motionless in the fog, his body trembling as the whispers clawed at his mind. The first Hollow One loomed over him, its monstrous body shifting between solid and mist, faces warping across its skin, dozens, maybe hundreds of stolen identities layered over one another. And yet it spoke with one voice. Choose. A war inside his mind. The black mist had already begun its work, seeping into Holloway's skin, curling into his veins like living ink. His mind, his very identity, was being unraveled. Memories weren't his anymore. They were being rewritten. The fog was replacing them with new ones. No, with old ones. Not his. Other lives. Other people. Other victims. A woman screaming for her husband in a town that no longer existed. A child's tiny hands reaching into the fog, only to be swallowed whole. A preacher who stood before a church that had never been built, whispering the Lord's Prayer as he faded into nothing. Holloway's fingernails dug into his palms. The fog was trying to erase him, to make him one of them. He gritted his teeth, sucking in a sharp breath. "Not today," he growled. Fighting the inevitable. The first Hollow One tilted its head, watching him with something close to curiosity. It hadn't expected him to fight back. Holloway's hands shook, but he forced his body to move, one step back, then another. The whispers grew louder, pressing against his skull like fingernails raking the inside of his head. "There is no escape." "Yeah?" Holloway muttered, gripping his gun. "Watch me." And then he ran, a desperate escape. The fog twisted violently, reacting to his movement. The Hollow Men, hundreds of them, turned in perfect unison, their faceless heads snapping toward him. The first Hollow One let out a sound, low and inhuman, a distant wail stretched across eternity, and the fog chased him. Holloway sprinted through what remained of Dover's Hollow, his boots slamming against pavement that wasn't there anymore. Buildings flickered in and out of existence, swallowed by the mist, like ghostly echoes of a town already lost. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. And then he saw it, a faint glow through the fog, the town's entrance sign, the edge of Dover's Hollow, the place where it all began. If he could just make it, if he could cross the threshold, maybe he could break free. Maybe the fog would let him go. Maybe the whispers screamed, and something grabbed his ankle. Dragged into the abyss, Holloway hit the ground hard, the impact ripping the breath from his lungs. The pavement beneath him felt wrong, softer than it should be, like he wasn't on solid ground anymore, like he was falling into the fog itself. He kicked violently, twisting, trying to free himself, but the thing holding him wasn't solid. It was shadow. Cold, stretching fingers of black mist, curling around his legs, dragging him downward. He turned his head. The first hollow one was closer now, towering over him. Its many faces opened their mouths, and they screamed. The sound tore through his mind, rattling inside his skull. And then the world collapsed. The other side, everything stopped. The screaming, the running, the fog, silence. Holloway opened his eyes, and he wasn't in Dover's Hollow anymore. He wasn't anywhere. He stood in an infinite black void, stretching in every direction. No buildings, no sky, no ground beneath his feet. But he wasn't falling. And he wasn't alone. The first hollow one stood before him, its form no longer shifting. Now it had a face. His face, a final conversation. It smiled at him, his own smile, but hollow, empty. You were always meant to be here. Holloway clenched his fists. I don't belong to you. On the thing's head tilted. But you do. You were always meant to see us. A sinking feeling settled in Holloway's gut. The fog, the hollow men, the way he had survived longer than anyone else. It wasn't by accident. He had been chosen. He had always been meant to end up here. And the worst part? Somewhere deep inside, he knew it was true. The thing took a step closer, and for the first time, Holloway felt afraid. Because he knew what was coming. The final choice. The first hollow one extended its hand. Stay, become us, or return and bring others. The last sacrifice. Holloway let out a slow breath. He knew what the choice was. If he left, if they let him go, he would never be the same again. The fog would never truly leave him. And sooner or later, he'd be back where he started. The only way to end this was to stay. His jaw tightened. His hands shook. And then finally he spoke. I won't bring anyone else. The first hollow one smiled, and everything turned to black. Dawn in Dover's Hollow. Deputy Tom Willis opened his eyes. He was lying in the middle of Main Street. The fog was gone. No more hollow men, no more whispers, and no more Sheriff Holloway. The town was still damaged. Some buildings collapsed, others barely standing. But the nightmare was over. The sun rose over Dover's Hollow, shining down for the first time in days. Willis sat up slowly, his body aching. And then he heard it. A whisper, soft, distant, coming from nowhere. And it said just 3 words. We never left. Willis closed his eyes. Because he knew Holloway was gone. But the fog would come back. It always did. Thank you for listening to Storytime with Killian Flinn. If you like his stories, go ahead and read some of his books. Check out his bio, links, and description. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast.